The gate opened without warning over Seoul. Not the kind of gate that hunter associations could schedule, monitor, or safely classify. This one tore through the sky above Gangnam at 6:47 in the morning, a jagged violet wound in the atmosphere 300 meters across, pulsing with mana pressure so dense that every measurement device within 4 kilometers simply stopped working. Buildings cracked. Car alarms triggered for 12 city blocks. The Hunter Association's emergency response teams scrambled into position within minutes, already running casualty projections, already calculating which S-rank teams were available, already dreading the answer. And then, before a single hunter could gear up, before Sung Jin-Woo could receive the notification, before the association's director could even reach his phone, something stepped out of the gate on its own. Not a monster, not a dungeon boss. A man in a yellow jumpsuit and a white cape, carrying a single plastic bag of groceries, looking mildly annoyed that the gate had deposited him several stories above street level. He fell. He landed on a parked car, completely flattened it without flinching, stood up, brushed dust off his suit, checked that his eggs hadn't broken, and then looked around at the screaming civilians with a calm, almost apologetic expression. The gate sealed behind him. The mana pressure vanished instantly. Every scanner in the area rebooted simultaneously, searched for a power signature, and returned the same result. Unreadable. Measurement error. Please recalibrate. The Hunter Association's earliest reports described an unknown entity of unmeasurable rank, believed to be a Class A or Class B hunter using some form of concealment technique. They were wrong in ways they couldn't yet comprehend, and by the time they understood how wrong they were, the world would already be in the process of changing permanently. This is only the beginning, and what comes after is considerably worse. If you want to know what happens when a being the system simply cannot process walks into the most dangerous ranked world ever built, subscribe now and don't miss a single part. What's coming will not be something you can catch up on easily. You've been warned. The Hunter Association's emergency field team arrived at the Gangnam impact site 11 minutes after the gate sealed. They came in 3 black vehicles, fully equipped, led by a B-rank field supervisor named Park Yi-won, who had handled over 60 gate incidents in his career and prided himself on reading a situation within 30 seconds of arrival. He needed considerably longer than that this time. The civilian evacuation was already underway. Police cordons were being established on the outer perimeter, and at the center of it all, standing next to a completely destroyed sedan, holding a plastic convenience store bag, and staring at a ramen shop across the street with obvious interest, was a short, bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who did not appear to be injured, alarmed, or even particularly aware that he had just fallen out of a dimensional rift. Park's first instinct was containment. His second instinct, the one that overrode the first almost immediately, was confusion. His team's portable mana scanners were standard Hunter Association grade, capable of measuring power signatures from E rank up through low S rank with reliable accuracy. When his junior analyst pointed the device at the man in the yellow suit, the scanner produced a long, uncomfortable beeping sound, displayed 3 question marks where a rank classification should have appeared, and then simply turned itself off. The analyst tried rebooting it. Same result. He tried a second scanner. Same result. Park Yi-won looked at his team, looked at the bald man, looked back at his team, and made the only sensible decision available to him. He called it up the chain immediately and told his superiors that whatever they were dealing with, it was not a standard gate emergence. The man in the yellow suit, meanwhile, had crossed the street and was now standing in front of the ramen shop's closed shutters, reading the operating hours posted on the door with an expression of mild personal disappointment. He turned around when Park approached, made eye contact, and waited with the patient, slightly vacant expression of someone who had been in confusing situations before and had long since stopped finding them particularly interesting. Park identified himself, explained that this was a restricted area, explained that the man needed to come with them for evaluation, and asked if the man could explain where he had come from. The man in the yellow suit said his name was Saitama. He said he wasn't sure exactly where he'd come from, because the gate thing had sort of just happened while he was on his way to the grocery store. He asked if the ramen place was usually closed at this hour or if something was wrong with it. Park Yi-won filed that interaction in a mental category he privately labeled complicated and called for a full association response team. Within 2 hours, Saitama was sitting in a Hunter Association intake facility on the edge of Seoul, in a white evaluation room that smelled like antiseptic and institutional carpet, being processed through the standard unregistered Hunter protocol. The intake officer was a composed, professional woman named Choi who had handled difficult registration cases before, and who maintained her calm expression right up until the moment the association's full-grade biometric scanner, the kind used to evaluate S-rank candidates, attempted to read Saitama's power level and produced an output that the system literally could not display. Not a number that was off the charts, not an error code suggesting equipment malfunction. The display simply went blank and stayed blank, as though the machine had encountered a concept it lacked the vocabulary to express and had decided, reasonably, to say nothing at all. Choi excused herself, went into the adjacent monitoring room, and spent 4 minutes on the phone with her direct supervisor. Her supervisor called the director's office. The director's office called the head of evaluation. 3 separate senior technicians were brought in to examine the equipment. All 3 confirmed that the hardware was functioning correctly. All 3 confirmed that the readings were genuine. All 3 looked at the footage of Saitama sitting in the evaluation chair with his grocery bag on his lap, eating a rice ball he had apparently brought from home, and arrived at the same conclusion with varying degrees of visible distress. The machine was working perfectly, and this man simply did not register as something the system knew how to measure. By late afternoon, the Hunter Association had elevated Saitama's intake file to restricted access, flagged his case for review by the S-Rank Evaluation Committee, and sent a preliminary alert to the National Hunter Bureau describing an unclassifiable individual of unknown origin. Sung Jin-Woo received a secondary notification through the Shadow Monarch's passive awareness network. Not a threat signal exactly, but something adjacent to one. A quiet disruption in the background architecture of the world's power structure, like a note played in a key that the instrument wasn't supposed to be able to reach. He read the notification, set it aside, and thought about it for the rest of the evening without arriving at a satisfying explanation. That bothered him considerably more than the notification itself. Saitama, for his part, asked 3 separate association staff members whether anyone could recommend a good place to eat nearby, was given 3 different answers, chose based on price, and went to bed in the temporary accommodation they'd assigned him without giving the evaluation results a second thought. He had been measured before. The measurements were never the interesting part. The S-Rank Evaluation Committee convened at 7 in the morning in a secured conference room on the 14th floor of the Hunter Association's Central Seoul facility, and the atmosphere inside that room was the specific kind of tense that comes not from open conflict, but from everyone present being highly competent and completely unable to explain what they were looking at. 7 people sat around the table. 4 were senior evaluation specialists with combined experience spanning over 200 S-Rank assessments. 1 was a technical director responsible for the association's measurement infrastructure. 1 was a legal advisor present because nobody was entirely sure what procedural category this situation fell into. And 1 was Woo Jin-chul, the association's head of special investigations, who had been pulled from a separate assignment at 4 in the morning and had not yet had enough coffee to fully disguise how unsettled he was. The file in front of each of them was thin. Saitama, no surname on record, no registered Hunter ID from any national database, No mana signature on file. Country of origin unclear. Age estimated late 20s, possibly early 30s. Arrived through an unsanctioned gate emergence above Gangnam District. Zero physical injuries despite a confirmed 40-meter fall onto a vehicle. The vehicle, a mid-size sedan, had been compressed to approximately 20 centimeters of its original vertical height. And then there was the scanner data, which the technical director spent 15 minutes explaining, and which ultimately communicated one thing. Every piece of measurement equipment the association owned had looked at this man and returned a result that could be summarized as, "We don't know how to answer this question." Woo Jin-Chul had seen unusual cases before. He had personally supervised the early evaluation of Sung Jin-Woo during the double dungeon incident aftermath, had watched a man reclassify from E rank to something the system genuinely struggled to contain, and had learned from that experience that the measurement infrastructure had limits the association preferred not to advertise. But Jin-Woo's initial scans had at least returned numbers, even if those numbers had eventually become meaningless. Saitama's scans returned nothing at all, which was a different category of problem entirely, because a system that returns a wrong number is a system that can still be worked with, while a system that returns silence is a system that has been asked a question it wasn't built to answer. The committee's decision was to proceed with a physical evaluation. This was standard protocol for unclassifiable individuals, and it gave the association something quantitative to work with even when the technical instruments failed. They had a dedicated testing facility 3 floors below ground level, reinforced to withstand S-rank combat output, equipped with impact sensors, mana flow monitors, and high-speed recording arrays. 3 evaluators would conduct the assessment. The process would be documented completely. Saitama was informed of the plan when a staff member knocked on his accommodation door at 8:30 in the morning and found him doing sit-ups in his room, counting in a low monotone voice, which the staff member later described in her incident report as somehow the most alarming thing I observed that day. The physical evaluation began at 10. The first phase was straightforward grip strength, impact force measurement, reflex response. Saitama approached each test with the mild cooperative energy of someone participating in a routine annual checkup. He squeezed the grip measurement device, and the readout spiked to its maximum value, held there for 1 second, and then the casing cracked. Not from any visible strain on Saitama's part, but simply because the pressure being applied to it exceeded what the casing was designed to structurally survive. He handed the broken device back to the evaluator with a mildly apologetic expression and waited for the next test. The impact force pad, rated to absorb and measure strikes up to the confirmed S-rank threshold, lasted 1 tap of Saitama's index finger before the internal sensor array shattered. He had not been trying. That was visibly, undeniably clear to every person watching the footage later. He had extended 1 finger, made contact with approximately the energy of someone pressing an elevator button, and the pad had structurally failed. The evaluation supervisor called a 10-minute pause. During the pause, Saitama sat on a bench against the wall, removed a paperback from somewhere inside his jumpsuit, and read quietly. He did not appear frustrated, bored in an aggressive way, or concerned. He appeared to be a man who had been asked to wait and had decided, practically, to use the time for something. The evaluation team spent the 10 minutes in an adjacent room having a conversation that was, by multiple accounts, extremely difficult. When they resumed, the lead evaluator, a composed veteran named Han, approached Saitama directly and asked him to demonstrate a strike at what he considered a moderate effort level, using the reinforced wall panel at the far end of the facility. Saitama looked at the panel. He looked at Han. He asked what moderate meant in this context because, he explained without any particular ego, he found it genuinely difficult to calibrate below a certain threshold. Han told him to do whatever felt comfortable. Saitama shrugged, walked to the panel, and tapped it once with the flat of his palm in the manner of someone testing whether a wall was hollow. The entire reinforced wall panel, 12 centimeters of layered, impact-absorbing composite material, rated to withstand repeated S-rank strikes, caved inward completely, every sensor behind it simultaneously destroyed, dust rising from the impact in a slow, expanding cloud that drifted gently across the silent room. Saitama turned back to the evaluation team, dusted off his hand, and asked if that was the kind of thing they were looking for. Woo Jin-Chul watched the footage 3 times that evening. Then he sent a single message to Sung Jin-Woo that read, "We have something I need you to see in person. It cannot wait." Sung Jin-Woo arrived at the Hunter Association's central facility at 9 in the evening, which was late enough that the main corridors were mostly empty, and the few staff members still present had the particular look of people who had been asked to stay for reasons nobody had fully explained to them yet. Woo Jin-Chul met him at the secure entrance personally, which itself communicated something, because Jin-Chul was not a man who made gestures without purpose. They walked to the monitoring room in near silence, and Jin-Chul pulled up the evaluation footage without preamble, without context, and without the kind of qualifying language that officials typically used when presenting something that made them uncomfortable. He simply pressed play and let Jin-Woo watch. Jin-Woo watched the grip test, the impact pad failure, and the wall panel destruction in sequence without changing his expression. When the footage ended, he sat quietly for a moment, and Jin-Chul, who had spent enough time around Jin-Woo to read his silences with some accuracy, recognized this particular silence as the one that meant the Shadow Monarch was not processing what he had seen as a tactical problem, but as something more fundamental. Jin-Woo finally asked one question. Had the system registered anything at all during the evaluation? Jin-Chul said no. Not a classification error, not an overflow reading, not even a residual mana trace. The system had observed a man destroy S-rank rated equipment with casual contact and had responded as though nothing had occurred. Jin-Woo nodded slowly and asked where Saitama was now. Jin-Chul said he was in his accommodation. Jin-Woo asked if he was being monitored. Jin-Chul said yes, continuously, and that the monitoring equipment had so far returned entirely ordinary data, normal temperature, normal movement, no mana output detectable at any frequency. A man sleeping in a temporary room, by every technical measure the association possessed, was indistinguishable from a man with no power whatsoever. Jin-Woo left without requesting access to Saitama directly. That restraint was, for anyone who understood how Jin-Woo operated, more telling than any aggressive response would have been. He needed more information before he moved, which meant that whatever he'd seen in that footage had genuinely given him pause, and things that gave Sung Jin-Woo pause were, by definition, worth pausing over. The Hunter Association's response over the following 48 hours moved along 2 parallel tracks that the institution's leadership was attempting, with limited success, to keep from intersecting. The first track was administrative. How to legally classify and manage an unregistered individual of unknown origin who had entered Korean territory through an unsanctioned gate, and who could not be ranked, measured, or formally categorized within any existing framework. The legal advisor from the evaluation committee produced a 40-page memo concluding, essentially, that the association's current protocols had no applicable provision for this situation, and that new ones would need to be created, which was the institutional equivalent of saying, "We don't know," in a way that consumed significantly more paper. The second track was political. 3 of South Korea's top guild masters had already received informal reports about the evaluation results through the networks of professional gossip and careful intelligence gathering that connected the upper tier of the Hunter world, and 2 of them had made contact with the association requesting information, while the third, the master of the Hunters Guild, Go Gun-hee's institutional successor, had made contact requesting something more specific, which was access. The guild master in question was a man named Kang D-Soo, 41 years old, high A rank approaching the S rank threshold by most estimates, and possessed of the kind of confident strategic intelligence that had built the Hunters Guild into its current position. He had received a description of the evaluation results from 2 independent sources, had cross-referenced them against the gate emergence data from the initial incident, and had arrived at a conclusion that was wrong in its specifics but directionally understandable. This Saitama was a foreign S-rank hunter, almost certainly at the extreme upper end of the S-rank spectrum, who was for reasons unknown concealing his actual power output from the association's instruments. This was not without precedent. There were hunters in China, in the United States, who had reasons to obscure their true capabilities when operating outside their home territory. The logical move, from Kang's perspective, was to make contact before the association locked the situation down, before other guilds got access, and before this individual was formally integrated into any structure that would complicate recruitment. What Kang did not consider, because it was not a category he had any reason to consider, was the possibility that the concealment was not deliberate, that the instruments weren't being fooled by technique or intent, but were simply encountering something that existed in a register they had never been designed to detect. He requested a supervised meeting with Saitama through official channels, and was granted a 40-minute session the following morning in one of the association's neutral conference rooms. He arrived with 2 aides, a prepared recruitment outline, and the practiced ease of a man who was very good at making powerful people feel that an offer was a favor rather than a transaction. Saitama arrived alone, 3 minutes late, and immediately asked if the coffee on the side table was available to anyone or just for decoration, because he'd had a long morning and the cafeteria downstairs had run out. Kang spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting delivering a carefully calibrated pitch about the Hunters Guild's resources, its global network, its compensation structure for high-rank independent hunters, and the unique opportunities available to someone of Saitama's apparent capabilities. Saitama drank his coffee and listened with an expression of polite attention that Kang would later describe, in a private conversation with his senior aide, as the expression of a man who was hearing words and processing them as sounds rather than as information. When Kang finished, Saitama was quiet for a moment, and then asked what exactly a guild did on a daily basis, because he was a little unclear on the overall concept. Kang explained dungeons, raids, rank evaluation, resource allocation. Saitama nodded through the explanation, and then asked whether it was mandatory to do all of that or whether you could mostly just handle whatever came up that seemed like it needed handling. Kang told his aide afterward that the meeting had been inconclusive. His aide, who had watched Saitama's face throughout and was considerably more perceptive than her employer on this particular occasion, said she didn't think the man was playing strategic games. She thought he genuinely hadn't found anything in the offer worth being interested in. Kang dismissed this. He scheduled a follow-up. He also, quietly, requested that the association arrange a dungeon access evaluation, a supervised raid entry where Saitama's combat capabilities could be observed in an actual dungeon environment rather than a testing room. It seemed, at the time, like a reasonable next step. Nobody in that room understood yet what a dungeon was about to experience when this particular man walked into it. The dungeon selected for the supervised evaluation was a B-rank gate that had opened 4 days earlier in an industrial district on the eastern edge of Seoul, the kind of mid-tier dungeon that the association routinely assigned to experienced B-rank teams for clearance. It had been held deliberately, access restricted, once the decision came down to use it for Saitama's field evaluation. The reasoning was straightforward. A B-rank dungeon was dangerous enough to produce meaningful data about combat capability without presenting a threat level that would create liability issues if something went wrong. 6 observers were assigned, 2 association evaluators, 2 from the Hunters Guild at Kang Disu's request, 1 technical specialist carrying the association's most advanced portable measurement array, and Wu Jin-Chul himself, who had inserted his presence into the evaluation on the grounds of procedural oversight, and who had, in reality, simply decided that he needed to see this with his own eyes rather than through footage. Jin-Woo was not officially part of the observer team. He was present anyway, positioned at the gate perimeter in civilian clothes, watching from a distance with the particular quality of attention that he applied to things he had not yet classified. His shadow soldiers were not deployed. He had decided that observation was the correct posture until he understood what he was dealing with, and that decision had required genuine discipline, because Jin-Woo was not, by nature or by history, a patient man when confronted with unknowns. Saitama was briefed on the dungeon evaluation at 8 in the morning by an association coordinator who explained the structure of the operation: entry, clearance, exit, observation at each stage, and who asked if he had any questions. Saitama asked if he needed to bring his own equipment or if the association provided it. The coordinator explained that most hunters used their own weapons and gear, that the association could supply standard-grade equipment if needed, and that his particular evaluation didn't require him to use anything specific. Saitama said that was fine then, because he didn't really use equipment anyway. The coordinator wrote this in her notes without visible reaction, having developed in the past 72 hours a professional resilience to things Saitama said that should have been alarming, but were delivered with such complete absence of performance that the alarm response somehow failed to activate. They entered the gate at 9:15. The dungeon interior resolved into a long stone corridor system, low-ceilinged, lit by the faint bioluminescent fungal growth that tended to characterize B-rank dungeon architecture in this region of the system. The air had the characteristic dense quality of high-mana environments, not uncomfortable for experienced hunters, but immediately noticeable, a kind of pressure against the chest that reminded the body it was somewhere the rules of the surface world applied differently. The observer team moved in standard formation behind Saitama, who walked at a comfortable pace approximately 3 meters ahead, hands in his jumpsuit pockets, looking at the walls with the mild curiosity of someone touring a moderately interesting building. The first contact came 4 minutes in. A cluster of B-rank dungeon wolves, 6 of them, large as draft horses, mono-reinforced muscle and bone under hide that could deflect standard B-rank weapon strikes, came around the bend of the corridor at speed, triggered by the intrusion of the party. They were exactly the kind of encounter the association had anticipated, dangerous enough to be meaningful, straightforward enough to be observable. Every evaluator in the party had their recording equipment active. The technical specialist had his measurement array pointed directly at Saitama's position. What happened next took approximately 1 second of real time and considerably longer to process. The lead wolf reached Saitama at full charge. Saitama stepped slightly to the side, not a dodge exactly, more the adjustment a person makes when something is moving toward them and they don't want to be directly in its path, and then delivered a single punch to the creature's flank with the casual economy of motion of someone knocking on a door. The wolf ceased to exist as a coherent physical object. That was the only accurate way to describe what the evaluators observed. The animal did not die in the conventional sense, did not sustain visible injury and collapse, but instead simply came apart, its entire physical structure resolving instantly into dispersed energy and matter, a brief flash of light at the point of impact, and then nothing. The remaining 5 wolves stopped their charge simultaneously. Not a tactical decision, not a fear response as typically observed in dungeon fauna. Something more immediate than that, something that looked, to the evaluators watching in frozen silence, like every animal instinct in those creatures firing at once in unanimous agreement that continuation was not a viable option. The wolves retreated, not aggressively, not into an alternate attack pattern. They simply turned and moved away from Saitama as quickly as their legs would carry them, disappearing back into the dungeon's interior passages. The The technical specialist looked at his measurement array. It had recorded 0 mana output from Saitama during the strike. No energy expenditure detectable at any wavelength. The impact force sensor in the array, which had been positioned to capture the strike, had recorded a number that the specialist would later describe to his supervisor as physically inconsistent with the continued structural integrity of the corridor. The corridor, for the record, was intact. Saitama had calibrated the strike precisely enough that the force had been contained entirely within the target. Which was, the specialist noted in a slightly unsteady voice while reviewing the data that evening, in some ways more alarming than if the corridor had collapsed, because it suggested a degree of control that made the casual delivery of the punch even harder to reconcile. Saitama turned back to the observer group and asked if that counted or if they needed to see more. Woo Jin-Chul said, after a pause that lasted slightly too long to be professionally neutral, that they would proceed deeper into the dungeon. They proceeded. Over the next 20 minutes, Saitama encountered a B-rank dungeon troll, 2 mana-construct guardians, and the dungeon's boss chamber, which contained a Gaytrift ogre, a B-rank apex predator that had killed 3 experienced hunters in a separate dungeon system 2 months prior. Each encounter ended with a single strike. No variation in Saitama's approach, no adjustment of effort or technique, no visible expenditure of energy or attention. The ogre, which stood 4 meters tall and had mana-reinforced bone structure rated to survive direct S-rank weapon strikes, lasted the same duration as the wolves. Approximately 1 second from the moment Saitama decided to end the encounter. What the observers noticed, beyond the mechanical fact of the destruction, was how the dungeon itself seemed to react. The mana density in the corridors, that constant background pressure of high-rank dungeon environments, had been dropping steadily from the moment Saitama entered. Not dramatically, not as a visible phenomenon, but the technical specialist's environmental sensors showed a consistent decline in ambient mana concentration across the entire dungeon interior, as though the dungeon's internal ecosystem, the invisible structure of energy that made a dungeon, was quietly stepping back from something it had no framework to process. By the time they reached the boss chamber, the readings were closer to a D-rank dungeon than a B-rank one. By the time they exited, they were near baseline surface levels. The dungeon cleared itself structurally 40 minutes after exit, which was normal. What was not normal was that 2 of the evaluators independently noted, without comparing notes until later, that the gate had seemed almost relieved to close. Jin-Woo watched the party exit from his position at the perimeter. He watched Saitama emerge last, squinting slightly in the late morning sunlight, apparently checking his grocery bag which he had left with an association staffer near the gate entrance, apparently reassured that the eggs had survived the wait. Jin-Woo stayed where he was for a long time after the official party departed. Something he had believed about the architecture of the world, about the system, about the hierarchy of power that the Shadow Monarch existed at the summit of had shifted in a way he couldn't yet quantify. He needed to think about it carefully. He needed to think about it before he acted, because Jin-Woo had learned, at considerable cost, that acting before understanding was a luxury that situations like this one did not extend. The Hunter Association's internal report on the dungeon evaluation was classified at the highest restriction level within 6 hours of the party's return. This was not a routine classification. The association classified sensitive material regularly, and the process was normally administrative, almost automatic. But this particular document was pulled from the standard processing pipeline and rerouted to a restricted access tier that required director-level authorization to open. The reason, as articulated by Woo Jin-Chul in his accompanying memo, was simple. The report's contents, if distributed through normal channels, would create a category of institutional panic that the association was not currently equipped to manage. The language Jin-Chul used was careful and measured, but what it communicated, stripped of its professional framing, was that they had observed something during that evaluation that could not be explained within the existing theoretical framework of the Hunter system, and that making that observation public before they had any kind of explanatory context would cause more damage than the information itself. The report reached 4 people above Jin-Chul's level. 2 of them read it twice. One of them read it 3 times and then called a contact at the International Hunter Association's Coordination Bureau in Geneva, using a personal line rather than an official channel. The 4th, Director Lim Tijiu, read it once, sat quietly in his office for approximately 20 minutes, and then convened an emergency session of the association's Strategic Advisory Committee for the following morning. He also, in a move that was either deeply pragmatic or deeply concerning depending on your perspective, requested that Sung Jin-Woo attend as an informal consultant, which was the institutional equivalent of admitting that the association's own analytical capacity had reached its limit, and that they needed the judgment of someone who operated closer to the outer edges of what the system contained. The Strategic Advisory Committee meeting lasted 4 hours. The technical data was presented first, the scanner failures, the evaluation results, the dungeon mana depletion readings, and the committee moved through denial, reframing, and reluctant acceptance in roughly 90 minutes, which was, given the nature of what they were being asked to accept, actually quite efficient. By the midpoint of the meeting, the conversation had shifted from, "What is this?" to "What do we do about it?" which was progress of a kind, even if the answers available to the second question were not noticeably better than the answers available to the first. Jin-Woo participated in the meeting with the minimal verbal engagement of someone who had already drawn their own conclusions, and was attending primarily to understand what the institution was planning, rather than to contribute to the planning itself. He answered direct questions accurately and briefly. When the committee's chief analyst asked whether, in Jin-Woo's assessment, Saitama represented a threat to South Korea's hunter infrastructure, Jin-Woo said no, and then added, after a pause that the analyst would remember clearly for weeks afterward, that the concept of threat implied an adversarial relationship with the existing structure that did not seem to apply to this situation, and that the more relevant question was what the existing structure planned to do when it encountered something that simply didn't fit inside it. The committee absorbed this in silence for a moment before the director moved the agenda forward. The decision that emerged from the meeting had 3 components. First, Saitama's case would be escalated to the International Hunter Association's Coordination Bureau, shared under a restricted protocol with the heads of the American, Chinese, and Japanese associations. Second, a dedicated monitoring team would be established, reporting directly to Jin-Chul, responsible solely for tracking Saitama's movements and activities within Korean territory. Third, and most delicately, the association would make an attempt to establish a voluntary cooperation framework with Saitama himself. Not a contract, not a formal registration, nothing that implied the association had any actual authority over him, but an arrangement that gave them some degree of predictability about where he was and what he was doing. The international notification produced results within 18 hours. The American Hunter Association's response was cautious and analytical. They requested the full technical data package and said they would evaluate through their own research division. The Japanese Association's response was faster and more alarmed. They had 2 S-rank hunters and a gate monitoring network along the Korean border, and the idea of an unclassifiable entity operating in the region without any coordination framework made their leadership visibly uncomfortable. The Chinese response was the most significant. Within 12 hours of receiving the notification, the monitoring of Dimensional Rift Activity Bureau, China's state-integrated hunter organization, the largest and most resource-heavy in the world, had elevated Saitama's case to their version of a strategic priority designation and had deployed 2 of their top analysts to Seoul under diplomatic cover to gather information directly. None of these responses were visible to Saitama, who had spent the day after the dungeon evaluation wandering around Seoul with the systematic curiosity of a tourist operating without a guidebook, stopping at food stalls, examining department store window displays, and at one point spending 45 minutes in a bookshop in Insadong looking at discounted manga volumes before deciding that none of them were as good as he remembered the genre being. The association's monitoring team tracked all of this in real time and filed 17 pages of daily activity reports that contained, in aggregate, no information that could be described as strategically meaningful. Saitama had lunch at a gimbap restaurant, returned to his accommodation, did 100 push-ups, watched 2 hours of television, and went to sleep. The monitoring team lead submitted her daily summary with the professional neutrality of someone who had decided that confusion was not a productive emotional posture and had moved past it by sheer force of routine. The cooperative arrangement conversation happened on day 3, conducted by Jin-Woo himself in the same neutral conference room where Kang Disu's recruitment meeting had taken place. Jin-Woo explained the association's position clearly and without the strategic framing that Kang had used. He said, essentially, that the association didn't know what Saitama was in terms of the system's categories, that they weren't in a position to require anything of him, but that it would be helpful if he was willing to let them know when he planned to engage with dungeons or gates, because it helped them coordinate their response to avoid civilian exposure. Saitama said that seemed reasonable enough. He asked if it meant he was officially a hunter now. Jin-Woo said not exactly, that the registration system required a classification the instruments couldn't produce, so the formal registration process was currently stalled. Saitama said that was fine with him because he hadn't really been trying to become a hunter. He'd mostly just ended up here and was figuring out what to do with himself in the meantime. Jin-Woo filed this exchange under productive and said nothing to his superiors about the deeply unsettled feeling it left him with, which was the feeling of a man who had just confirmed that the most powerful entity his organization had ever encountered was operating on no agenda whatsoever, and found that fact considerably more difficult to manage than malice would have been. Malice had a logic to it. Boredom, genuine and uncomplicated, was something the association's entire strategic framework had no tool for addressing. 3 days later, the first Monarch level gate opened above Tokyo, and the Shadow Monarch system notification arrived at the same moment that an association staffer knocked on Saitama's door to ask if he'd be interested in accompanying a response team. Saitama said sure, and asked if they had a good place to get dinner in Tokyo, because he'd never been. The Tokyo Gate was not like the gates that hunter associations dealt with on a weekly basis. It was not a standard dimensional rift producing a contained dungeon space that could be cleared by an organized team working within established protocols. It opened at 3 in the afternoon above Shinjuku, at an altitude of approximately 400 meters, and it opened all at once. Not the gradual crack and expand sequence of a normal gate emergence, but an instantaneous full aperture tier that measured 2 kilometers across at its widest point, the largest gate event recorded in Japan's hunter history, and the second largest on record globally. The monopressure wave from the opening knocked out power across 6 city wards, shattered glass in every building within 800 meters of ground zero, and produced a sound described by the 17,000 people in immediate proximity as something between a thunderclap and a frequency that the body registered before the ears did, a vibration that lived in the chest cavity and the back teeth, and refused to leave for hours afterward. The Japan Hunter Association had 4 S-rank hunters available for emergency deployment. All 4 were on site within 22 minutes, which was fast by any standard, and not fast enough by the standard this gate was operating on. The first creatures through the aperture were not standard dungeon fauna. They were sovereign-class constructs. The advance units deployed by Monarch-level entities ahead of direct engagement, monodense architectural weapons rather than living things, each one measuring between 15 and 30 meters, moving with the coordinated purposefulness of something controlled by a single intelligence rather than operating on animal instinct. 11 of them came through in the first 2 minutes. Japan's S-rank response team engaged immediately, and the engagement was brave and tactically disciplined, and was, within 4 minutes, clearly insufficient. Sung Jin-Woo felt the gate the moment it opened. The Shadow Monarch's passive awareness of large-scale dimensional events was not something he could turn off. It was structural, woven into what he was, a constant low-frequency sensitivity to the places where the world's membrane was thin or broken. This gate registered at a level that moved it immediately out of the category of significant event and into the category of direct Monarch involvement, which meant the situation in Tokyo was not a dungeon emergency, but the opening move of something that operated at a scale the Hunter system had been built in response to. He was airborne in under 3 minutes, moving toward Tokyo at a velocity that made conventional aircraft irrelevant. Saitama was on the association transport with 4 Korean S-rank hunters when the in-flight briefing updated to reflect that 2 of Japan's S-rank responders had been incapacitated, and the other 2 were in full defensive retreat. The Korean hunters in the transport absorbed this information with the controlled professional stillness of people who were frightened and had long practiced not showing it. Saitama looked out the window at the cloud cover for a moment, and then asked one of the evaluators accompanying the team what sovereign-class constructs were exactly, because the briefing document had used the term twice without defining it. The evaluator explained. Saitama said, "Oh," in a tone that suggested the information had been received and filed without generating any particular emotional response, which the evaluator found in the moment both reassuring and deeply strange. They arrived over Shinjuku to a skyline that had changed. 3 of the high-rise towers in the immediate gate perimeter had sustained structural damage from construct impact. 1 was burning. The gate above was still active, still discharging. The 11 initial constructs had been joined by 7 more, and the 4 that Japan's retreating S-ranks had managed to damage were rebuilding themselves from ambient mana with a speed that made sustained engagement feel pointless. The Korean transport circled at a holding altitude, while the team lead attempted to reach Japan's incident command for coordination. From the window, the scale of what was happening was visible in a way that briefing documents couldn't convey. Shinjuku, one of the densest urban environments on Earth, was being systematically disassembled from above by entities that treated reinforced concrete and steel as negligible variables. Saitama unclipped his seat harness and asked if there was a way to get down there. The team lead said they were holding for clearance and coordination. Saitama asked how long that usually took. The team lead said it depended. Saitama looked out the window again at a construct that had just removed the top 6 floors from a skyscraper with the patient efficiency of something that had all the time it needed, and said that he was going to head down now if nobody needed him specifically on the transport. The team lead started to explain that the protocol required. And then Saitama opened the emergency exit at 5,000 feet of altitude and stepped out, and the explanation became irrelevant. He fell through the cloud layer, through the smoke rising from the burning tower, through the monodense lower atmosphere of the gate perimeter, and landed in the middle of Shinjuku's main commercial boulevard with an impact that cracked the asphalt in a 10-meter radius, and sent a shockwave through the ground that every seismic sensor in a 30-kilometer range would record as a minor earthquake. He stood up, looked at the nearest construct, a 30-meter mono-architecture entity currently in the process of reducing a building to component rubble, and then looked around at the general situation with the expression of a man taking inventory. What happened over the next 4 minutes was observed by 6,000 civilians who had not yet evacuated, by the 4 Japanese S-rank hunters watching from their defensive position, by the Korean response team watching from the transport above, by Woo Jin-chul watching a live feed in Seoul, and by Sung Jin-Woo, who arrived over the site at the start of the second minute and stayed airborne, watching, not intervening. 4 minutes. 18 sovereign-class constructs. Saitama moved through the construct formation in a loose, unhurried circuit, striking each one once. And the strikes were not the dramatic energy release events that S-rank combat typically produced: no mana shockwaves, no light effects, no visible power output. Each construct simply stopped existing at the point of contact, the mana architecture that constituted its physical form scattering instantly. No residual energy, no debris field, just the sharp crack of displaced air, and then absence where something enormous had been. 18 constructs. 4 minutes. Then Saitama stopped in the middle of the boulevard, looked up at the gate still open above the city, and waited to see if anything else was coming through, with the patient posture of someone waiting for a bus. From his position above the site, Sung Jin-Woo was very still. He had felt the Monarch's presence in those constructs, the commanding intelligence threading through the mana architecture, directing, controlling, the unmistakable signature of an entity that sat above the system rather than within it. And he had watched that presence encounter Saitama, watched the moment of contact, and seen something he had not expected and could not immediately explain. The Monarch's intelligence had not retreated strategically or adapted tactically. It had recoiled. Not from the physical destruction of the constructs, which was a material loss, replaceable, but from something in the contact itself, something in the encounter with whatever Saitama was, that had produced a response in a monarch-level entity that Jin-Woo could only describe, with the reluctant precision of someone who chose their words carefully, as alarm. The gate above Shinjuku sealed 12 minutes later, abruptly, without completing whatever deployment it had been building toward. No monarch emerged. No second wave came. The gate simply closed, as though whatever intelligence had opened it had decided, on the basis of new information, that continuing was not worth the cost. Saitama stood in the street for another few minutes, looking up at the empty sky where the gate had been, then looked around at the destroyed boulevard, the burning buildings, the distant sounds of emergency vehicles, and said, to no one in particular, since the closest person was a civilian hiding behind an overturned truck 60 meters away, that he guessed that was it then. He sounded, to the person behind the truck, who would relay the quote to 17 separate journalists over the following week, faintly disappointed. There is a layer of existence that operates beneath the visible surface of the world's conflicts, a stratum where the forces that had shaped the hunter system from its inception, the monarchs, the rulers, the ancient architecture of a war that predated human civilization by geological epochs, conducted their awareness of events in ways that didn't translate into the physical register of mana signatures or dungeon emergences. Sung Jin-Woo had access to this layer through what he was, and what he understood about it was partial and imperfect and constantly being revised. But one thing he knew with certainty, because he had experienced it from multiple angles, was that the monarchs did not recoil from encounters. They calculated, they repositioned, they absorbed losses and adapted their strategy, but the baseline emotional register of a monarch-level entity was not one that contained alarm as a functional state. They were too old, too structured in their certainty of purpose, too constitutionally committed to the logic of their war to respond to individual encounters with anything resembling the kind of reactive withdrawal he had observed when those Shinjuku constructs made contact with Saitama. He spent 2 days after Tokyo in a state of focused internal analysis, reviewing everything the Shadow Monarch's awareness had recorded during the encounter, looking for the specific texture of what he had felt in that monarch's reaction. It wasn't fear in any form he recognized. It was closer to the response of a system encountering an input that fell outside its operational parameters, not threatening exactly, but destabilizing in a way that was separate from threat, The way a calculation can be destabilized not by a wrong answer, but by a question it wasn't built to process. Whatever the monarch had felt when its constructs encountered Saitama, it had been enough to close a 2-kilometer gate over Tokyo and withdraw from the engagement entirely. That was not a decision made from a position of tactical confidence. The monarchs convened in the way that monarchs convened, which was not in a physical location and not in a manner that left traces a human monitoring system could detect, but in a register of collective awareness that the Shadow Monarch could perceive at its edges without accessing its center. Jin-Woo caught the shape of this convening without its content, the way a person in an adjacent room can tell that an argument is happening without hearing the words. There were 7 distinct presences. The deliberation, whatever its specific content, lasted approximately 3 hours in subjective terms and produced a detectable shift in the monarch's collective strategic posture. A contraction, a pulling back of the distributed probe networks they maintained across the world's gate infrastructure. A narrowing of focus that Jin-Woo interpreted, with carefully hedged confidence, as the early signature of a situation being reclassified. In the physical world, the consequence of this reclassification became apparent within 48 hours of Tokyo. 3 mid-rank gate emergences that had been trending toward activation in separate global locations. 2 in Southeast Asia, 1 in Northern Europe, stabilized unexpectedly and failed to escalate, their mana pressure readings declining back toward baseline as though the energy feeding them had been redirected. The hunter associations monitoring these sites reported the stabilizations as positive developments without understanding their cause. Jin-Chul, reviewing the global gate data in Seoul with the benefit of Jin-Woo's analysis, understood them differently. The monarchs were pulling resources, consolidating, reconsidering their deployment pattern. They were not retreating from their larger objective. They were pausing to incorporate new information, and the new information was Saitama. Saitama was, during this period, in Tokyo, because the Korean Association's transport had eventually landed, and the post-incident coordination process had kept the team in the city for 2 days. He had, by most accounts, spent this time more productively than anyone else involved in the incident. He had found a ramen shop in the Shibuya district that he described to an association staffer as genuinely excellent, had visited 3 convenience stores comparing their product selections, had slept 9 hours both nights, and had expressed mild curiosity about whether the association was going to do anything with the broken pieces of the sovereign-class constructs that were scattered across Shinjuku, because they looked interesting. A materials researcher who examined one of the construct fragments later confirmed that its structural composition was unlike any cataloged dungeon material, and requested that as many fragments as possible be collected for study. The fragments had already been cleared as hazardous debris by the city cleanup operation. Saitama had, without knowing it, suggested what would have been the most scientifically valuable course of action, by noticing that broken things were sometimes worth looking at. The first direct monarch approach came on the 3rd day after Tokyo, not through a gate, not through constructs or proxy forces, but through a vector that the Hunter system's monitoring infrastructure was not equipped to detect, because it wasn't a physical intrusion. The monarch of beastly fangs, one of the more aggressive members of the monarchic structure, the entity that historically preferred direct engagement over strategic maneuvering, made contact with the dungeon ecosystem of the Korean peninsula in a way that was less an emergence than a presence, a seeping of awareness into the space below the surface world, probing the texture of what was there. It was looking for Saitama the way a predator looks for prey, not by sight, but by the disruption an unfamiliar thing creates in the environment around it. What it found confused it in a way that was new. Saitama had no mana signature. He had no system classification, no dungeon resonance, no power infrastructure that the monarch's awareness could follow back to a source. Hunting by disruption required a disruption to trace, and Saitama, standing in a convenience store in Seoul at the moment of the monarch's probe, examining the refrigerated drink section, was, to the monarch's extended awareness, essentially invisible. Not hidden in the way that Jin-Woo could conceal his presence using Shadow Monarch abilities, which still left a negative space that something looking for it could identify. Invisible in the more fundamental sense of simply not emitting the signals that the monarch's perception was designed to detect. He wasn't blocking the scan. There was nothing to block with. He was standing in the middle of the world, and the world's sensing architecture was looking directly at him and returning, repeatedly, the information that nothing of note was there. The monarch of beastly fangs withdrew its probe, not hastily but thoughtfully, and that thoughtfulness was itself significant. This was not an entity that typically moved thoughtfully. It reported to the collective monarch awareness with the functional equivalent of a question, which monarchs did not usually ask each other, because certainty was constitutive of what they were, and questions implied its absence. The question was, what does it mean when something is clearly present but the system cannot find it? And the collective awareness that received this question sat with it, in a silence that Jin-Woo, at the perimeter of his perception, could feel the weight of without hearing its content. Sung Jin-Woo decided that morning that it was time to stop observing from a distance. He found Saitama at the convenience store, bought a drink from the same refrigerated section, and stood next to him in the way that people stand next to strangers in small spaces, close enough to speak without raising his voice. He said, without preamble, that he had a few questions if Saitama had a moment. Saitama said sure. He was just deciding between two different flavored drinks and wasn't in a hurry. Jin-Woo asked where Saitama had come from, and Saitama gave the same answer he had given the association, a gate, grocery shopping, unclear on the specifics of how. Jin-Woo asked how long Saitama had been as strong as he was. Saitama thought about it and said a few years, give or take, ever since the training paid off. Jin-Woo asked what the training had been. Saitama said 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run, every day for 3 years, no days off. Jin-Woo looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. Saitama chose the citrus drink, noted that the price was reasonable, and asked if Jin-Woo wanted to split the cost of a bag of chips, because he'd noticed there was a 2-for-1 deal on the aisle end cap, and he didn't need 2 bags, but the math made it appealing. Jin-Woo bought the chips. He walked with Saitama for 2 blocks afterward without saying much, thinking about the monarchs probing for something they couldn't find and finding the answer, which he had just heard delivered in a flat, earnest voice in a convenience store, even more difficult to process than the silence of a failed scan. The most destabilizing force in the architecture of a war that had been running for longer than human history was a man who had done push-ups until something fundamental in the nature of physical limitation had simply given up and stopped applying to him, and who had no particular feelings about it either way. That was the problem. That was the specific, irreducible problem that the monarchs were now sitting with, and that Jin-Woo was now sitting with, and that the hunter system as a whole was going to have to find a way to accommodate. Saitama wasn't a weapon, wasn't an ally in any structured sense, wasn't an enemy, wasn't a variable that fit into any of the categories that the system had been built to manage. He was something that had arrived and was here, and would continue to be here, and the world was going to have to figure out what that meant while he figured out where to get good dinner. The rulers were not the monarchs. This distinction mattered enormously in the architecture of the conflict that had shaped the world's gate infrastructure, and it was a distinction that most hunters, even S-rank hunters, never fully understood because the rulers operated at a remove from the physical world that made their influence nearly impossible to perceive directly. Where the monarchs sought destruction, the erasure of all life as the terminal objective of their war, the rulers sought preservation, the perpetuation of the world as a vessel for the sole energy they had committed themselves to protecting across an incomprehensible span of time. They had built the system. Not the Hunter Association's bureaucratic apparatus, but the deeper system, the ranking infrastructure, the gates, the dungeons, the entire framework through which mana interfaced with human physical potential and produced hunters. It was a cultivation project of cosmic scale, designed to raise humanity to a point where it could participate meaningfully in a war it hadn't known it was part of. The rulers communicated with their chosen vessels, and they monitored the state of the world through the system they had built. And what the system was currently reporting about Saitama was the same thing it had been reporting since he arrived. Nothing classifiable. The rulers had built the system to measure everything within a certain range of physical and metaphysical parameters, and that range was, by any reasonable standard, vast. It encompassed everything from a newly awakened E-rank hunter to the Shadow Monarch himself, an entity whose power the system acknowledged at the outer edge of its measurement capacity. The range had been built with margin. It had been built to accommodate extremes. It had not been built to accommodate something that sat entirely outside the dimensional axis the measurement system operated along, because the rulers had not, in constructing it, conceived of the possibility that such a thing could exist. The vessel through which one of the higher rulers maintained its most direct awareness of the current world state was not a hunter and was not known to the association. It was an elderly academic in Busan, a retired theoretical monophysicist who had spent 40 years studying gate emergence patterns, and who experienced the ruler's communications as a particular quality of late-night clarity, a sense of understanding arriving from outside himself that he had long since stopped questioning, and had simply learned to write down when it came. He filled 12 pages of his research notebook in the early hours of the 4th day after Tokyo, and when he read them back at dawn, he sat very still for a long time, and then made a call to a number he had never used before. A contact passed to him years ago with the instruction that it was for situations that had no other appropriate channel. The number connected to Sung Jin-Woo's personal line. He answered on the second ring because he had been awake already, because he had felt the ruler's communication at the edges of the Shadow Monarchs, awareness the way he had felt the monarch convening, present but not accessible, a signal in a frequency he could detect but not decode. The old man read him the relevant passages. Jin-Woo listened without interrupting, which took considerable discipline because what he was hearing was the ruler's assessment of Saitama, rendered in the language of theoretical physics by a 73-year-old academic who had no combat experience and no frame of reference for what any of it meant in practical terms, but who conveyed the essential content clearly enough. The rulers had examined everything the system had returned about Saitama, had cross-referenced it against their own much deeper analytical capacity, and had arrived at a conclusion that they were communicating with what the old man's notes described, in translated ruler conceptual language, as profound structural humility. The rulers did not know what Saitama was. They could determine, through analysis the system itself couldn't perform, that his physical existence was genuine. He was not a construct, not a projection, not a dimensional artifact. He was a living organism, human in biology, operating in the physical world with full material presence. What they could not determine was the source or nature of his physical capacity, because it did not connect to mana, did not connect to soul energy, did not connect to any of the metaphysical infrastructure that the rulers understood power to flow through. He was strong in a way that was prior to all of those systems, underneath them in some sense, operating in a register that predated the frameworks through which the rulers' war was conducted, and the closest conceptual language the old man's notes could find for what the rulers were communicating was this. They had built the system to be a ceiling, a structure within which the highest achievable human power could develop, and Saitama was not beneath that ceiling. He was somewhere the ceiling's existence was not a relevant fact. Jin-Woo thanked the old man and ended the call, and sat with this information in the way he sat with things that required fundamental revision of his understanding. The Shadow Monarch was the apex of the system as it had been constructed. He had understood himself, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who had climbed the full height of a structure and confirmed there was nothing above him to be at the top, and he was within the system. That remained true and was not diminished. But the system, it turned out, was not the only structure. The system was one framework among possible frameworks, and Saitama occupied a different one that the rulers themselves had not built and could not map, and this meant that the war between monarchs and rulers, which Jin-Woo had positioned himself at the center of, which he had bled for and rebuilt himself around, was a war being conducted inside a structure that had a completely unaware neighbor. He needed to see Saitama again, not to evaluate him, not to recruit him, not to fold him into any strategy. Those impulses had been present in the first days and had since resolved themselves against the evidence. He needed to see him because there was one question that the ruler's analysis had not answered, and that the association's data had not answered, and that his own observation had not answered, and it was the question that actually mattered. What would happen when a monarch moved against Saitama directly, not through constructs, not through probes, not through the careful maneuvering of entities conducting themselves with the strategic patience of the very old and the very certain, but in person with full commitment? He found Saitama on the Han River walkway in the early afternoon, sitting on a bench watching the water, eating a convenience store onigiri with the quiet contentment of someone who had found a thing they liked, and was doing it without complication. Jin-Woo sat on the far end of the same bench and was silent for a moment. Then he said that he wanted to tell Saitama something, and he wanted Saitama to take it seriously even if it didn't seem like something that required serious attention. Saitama said okay. Jin-Woo said that the things that had attacked Tokyo were going to try again, not through gates and not through monsters, but directly as themselves, which was a different category of dangerous than anything that had happened so far. Saitama asked how different. Jin-Woo thought about how to calibrate the answer and said, the kind of different where every hunter on Earth working together has never been enough to stop one of them alone. Saitama finished his onigiri, folded the wrapper neatly, and put it in his pocket to throw away later. He said that sounded like it might be more interesting, at least. He didn't say it with bravado. He said it with the mild, genuine hopefulness of someone who had been finding things too easy for a long time, and had not yet given up on the possibility that something wouldn't be. Jin-Woo looked at him for a moment and felt something that he couldn't immediately name, not pity, not admiration, not the tactical assessment he typically made of powerful individuals. Something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of someone who had also spent time at a level where nothing was hard enough, where the system built to produce challenge had delivered everything it had, and it hadn't been sufficient, where the honest answer to, "Are you satisfied?" was no, and the reason was not greed or ambition, but something more fundamental and more human than either. He didn't say any of that. He said he would let Saitama know when the direct approach came, because he would feel it before it arrived. Saitama said he appreciated that, and asked if Jin-Woo wanted to walk back toward the city because he'd seen a place selling fish cakes earlier and the price had seemed reasonable. Jin-Woo stood up and walked with him, and the two most powerful beings currently operating in the world went to get fish cakes from a street vendor on the Han River walkway, and the monarchs watched through their distributed awareness and tried to understand what they were seeing and couldn't, and the trying was costing them something they could feel but not name. The monarch of destruction did not send constructs. It did not open a gate above a city and deploy advance forces and wait to measure the response. It had watched Tokyo, had participated in the collective deliberation afterward, had listened to the monarch of beastly fangs describe the texture of a probe that returned nothing, and had reached a conclusion that was characteristic of an entity whose entire strategic identity was built around the application of overwhelming direct force. The uncertainty was the problem, and the way to resolve uncertainty was contact. Not cautious contact, not a graduated escalation through proxy engagements. Contact at full presence, maximum commitment, the kind of arrival that foreclosed the possibility of ambiguity about what was happening and what the outcome was intended to be. It came on a Tuesday morning, which was not a detail that meant anything to the monarch, but which meant a great deal to the 700,000 people who happened to be in Seoul's central districts when the sky above Gwanghwamun Square cracked open, and something stepped through that was not using a gate in any sense the system understood, but was simply moving from one layer of existence to another because the distinction between layers was not, for an entity of this order, a meaningful barrier. Sung Jin-Woo felt it coming 4 minutes before it arrived. The Shadow Monarch's awareness registered the approach as a pressure change in the metaphysical substrate of the city. Not mana exactly, but the deeper medium that mana was an expression of, the foundational stuff of the world's energy architecture compressing ahead of something that was displacing it by sheer proximity. He had already been moving before the physical manifestation began, and he was in Gwanghwamun airborne and fully committed, shadow soldiers deployed in a perimeter, full Shadow Monarch presence engaged, when the Monarch of Destruction completed its transition and stood in the square. It was enormous, not in the way that dungeon bosses were enormous scale deployed as threat display, size as tactical communication. The Monarch of Destruction was large the way that a natural force was large, the way that the thing causing the storm was larger than the storm itself, its physical form in this world a partial projection of something that didn't fully fit in the space available, compressed into human perceivable dimensions by the necessity of operating in a physical environment. It stood perhaps 40 meters in the vertical dimension, though the boundary of where it ended and the disrupted atmosphere around it began was not clean or stable. The mana pressure it exuded had already shattered every window in the square, had cracked the pavement in a 200-meter radius, had knocked every civilian who hadn't evacuated flat to the ground and was holding them there. It looked at Gwanghwamun Square, and then it looked at Seoul beyond it, and the looking had physical weight. Jin-Woo met it in the first 30 seconds. The Shadow Monarch versus the Monarch of Destruction was not a contest that had a clean outcome in conventional terms. They were on the same tier of the war's power structure, operating in the same register, and an engagement between them was less a fight in the ordinary sense than a collision of enormous forces, each capable of restructuring the physical world in their vicinity. The outcome determined by factors of strategy and commitment, and the specific advantages each brought to a direct confrontation. Jin-Woo was fast, precise, operating with the tactical intelligence of someone who had been in desperate fights, since before his power was equal to the challenge, and had survived by being smarter than whatever he was facing. The Monarch of Destruction was committed, ancient, and operating on the simple strategic premise that enough force applied directly to any problem resolved it. They were still engaged, Jin-Woo holding ground through a combination of offensive pressure and shadow army attrition, taking damage he could absorb and regenerate from, preventing the monarch from focusing on the city behind him, when Saitama arrived. He came from the direction of the subway station 2 blocks east of the square, which was where he had been when Jin-Woo's warning notification had reached him via the Association Emergency Contact Protocol they had established after Tokyo. He had been eating breakfast. He had finished the breakfast first, on the practical grounds that leaving food unfinished was wasteful, and then he had walked, not run, walked, because running in a crowded evacuation corridor was counterproductive, toward the sound of the engagement. He emerged into Gwanghwamun Square and took in the scene with the same inventory-taking expression he had used in Shinjuku. Jin-Woo mid-combat with something that was currently holding him in place with one arm, while the other restructured the physical architecture of the square's northern edge into something that didn't obey conventional geometry. Shadow soldiers dissolving on contact with the monarch's passive energy field faster than Jin-Woo could replace them. Saitama looked at this for a moment. Then he walked toward the Monarch of Destruction at a comfortable pace, hands in his pockets, crossing the shattered pavement of the square without apparent awareness of the mana pressure that had flattened a trained S-rank hunter's support army, and was currently registering on monitoring equipment 3 kilometers away as something that would require a new measurement scale to accurately express. The Monarch of Destruction became aware of him at a distance of approximately 50 meters. This awareness was not a surprise recognition of an unknown presence. The Monarchs had been tracking Saitama since Tokyo, had registered his approach in the ambient mana field, had noted his arrival at the square's edge. What changed at 50 meters was the quality of the Monarch's awareness of him, a shift from the background monitoring of an entity cataloging variables to the foreground attention of an entity encountering something that required direct consideration. Its engagement with Jin-Woo did not pause. It was too committed, too deep in the combat logic of the moment. But something in the Monarch's processing shifted, a redistribution of attention that Jin-Woo felt in the microsecond reduction of pressure on his position, and which he used immediately, generating a burst of offensive shadow force that the Monarch deflected, while most of its focus tracked the bald man in the yellow suit walking across the square. The Monarch had decided, in its collective deliberation, that the anomaly required testing, not elimination, not yet. The uncertainty about what Saitama was had not been resolved enough to commit to a specific response. But contact, genuine contact, enough force applied to produce a reaction that would answer the question the probes had failed to answer. It released Jin-Woo from active engagement, shunting him backward with a force that sent him 100 meters through the air before the Shadow Monarch's ability stabilized him, and turned its full attention to Saitama. The strike it delivered was not calibrated for a human opponent. The Monarch of Destruction did not have a setting that low in its operational range. What it delivered was a full commitment direct strike from an entity that had, in previous engagements, cracked continental plates when it needed to make a point. The force of it hit Saitama in the chest, and the physical consequence in the immediate environment was dramatic. The pavement of the square was gone, vaporized. The ground beneath it was gone to a depth of 12 meters. The shockwave from the impact knocked over every vehicle within 400 meters and stripped the facades off buildings in a 2-block radius. The noise of it was heard in Incheon. Saitama slid backward approximately 3 meters across the crater his landing had generated. His jumpsuit had a small tear on the left sleeve. He looked down at the tear, back up at the Monarch, and his expression shifted in a way that was visible even from Jin-Woo's position 100 meters away. Not anger, nothing as purposeful as anger, but the specific expression of someone who had been hopping for something and had found again that the hope was not going to be satisfied. He had felt it. The Monarch had hit him with something that could crack continental geology, and he had felt it, and it had moved him 3 meters, and that was the furthest he had been moved in years. And it still wasn't enough. He hit the Monarch of Destruction once. The shockwave from the punch reached the edge of Seoul before the sound did. Monitoring stations in Japan recorded a seismic event. The Monarch of Destruction, an entity that had existed since before the formation of the current world and that had never, in all of that existence, experienced what came next, was simply sent. Not destroyed, not killed. The Monarchs could not be killed by physical force in the conventional sense. But the force of Saitama's punch transmitted through the Monarch's physical projection and continued through every layer of its existence simultaneously, cascading through its metaphysical structure with an energy that had no origin point in the mana system, and therefore had no interaction with the Monarch's considerable defenses against mana-based force. And the Monarch of Destruction was ejected from the physical world entirely. Its projection collapsed. Its presence in this dimensional layer terminated so abruptly and completely that the space where it had been registered, for 3 full seconds, as a vacuum. Then the air rushed back in, and Gwanghwamun Square was quiet, and there was a very large crater where the square had been, and Saitama was standing at its center looking at his hand, and looking at the empty space where the Monarch had been and looking at his hand again. And Jin-Woo landed 40 meters away and also looked at the empty space, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally, Saitama said that was a little better, at least. He said it the same way he had said the fish cakes were reasonably priced. Jin-Woo sat down on the edge of the crater because he felt, with the assessment of a man who had survived things that should have killed him through a combination of power and will and careful management of his own physical limits, that sitting down was appropriate. The other monarchs had felt what happened. He knew they had felt it because he had felt them feel it, a simultaneous recoil across the entire collective monarch awareness, a unified flinch from 6 entities that did not flinch, a moment of absolute collective silence in the metaphysical layer that Jin-Woo monitored from the Shadow Monarch's position. They had sent their most aggressive member in direct engagement, and it had lasted 11 seconds of contact, and the outcome had been ejection from the physical world by something that used no mana and generated no energy signature and could not be measured by any instrument in existence. The monarchs were not going to send another direct probe. Whatever they did next was going to be different in kind, because the category of direct engagement had just been tested and closed as a viable option. And that meant the next move would be something that didn't rely on force at all, which was, Jin-Woo thought, sitting in the rubble of what had been one of Seoul's most famous public squares, considerably more dangerous than anything they had tried so far. The ejection of the monarch of destruction from the physical world did not kill it. Jin-Woo had known this from the moment the monarch's projection collapsed, and the distinction mattered enormously in terms of what came next. An entity that could be destroyed was an entity that could be managed. You found the method, you applied it, you concluded the problem. An entity that had been forcibly displaced from the physical layer, but continued to exist in the deeper metaphysical substrate, was an entity that would return, and would return having incorporated the information from its encounter, and would return differently. The monarchs were old enough and patient enough to take any amount of time necessary to reconfigure their approach, and the one non-negotiable fact of their strategic character was that they did not absorb a loss and repeat the action that had produced it. They learned. Slowly, sometimes, by their own timescale, but with absolute commitment. What Jin-Woo understood about the monarch's new position was this: they had tested physical dominance and it had failed. They had tested probe-based intelligence gathering and it had failed. They had tested strategic withdrawal and it had produced no useful information. The remaining options, filtered through the logic of entities whose entire operational framework was built around the manipulation of the world's energy systems, were options that didn't rely on force or intelligence or patience in the conventional senses. They were options that used the system itself as the instrument, the deep structural architecture of gates and dungeons and hunter development that the monarchs could interface with, not as a tool they had built, but as a substrate they had always known how to corrupt. The rulers understood this shift the moment it began, and their communication through the old physicist in Busan was urgent in a way that previous messages had not been, stripped of the measured analytical tone and reduced to something closer to a direct warning. Jin-Woo received the call at 2 in the morning, 2 days after Gwangwamun, and the message was short. The monarchs were not going to attack Saitama. They were going to attack the world around him. Specifically, they were going to accelerate the gate destabilization protocol they had been building toward for months, the process by which enough simultaneous high-rank gate emergences, strategically positioned, could overwhelm the hunter system's response capacity and produce cascading civilian catastrophe at a scale that would make Tokyo look like a preliminary assessment. They couldn't hurt Saitama, so they were going to make Saitama watch. It was, Jin-Woo acknowledged in the privacy of his own assessment, a genuinely intelligent adaptation. Not because it would stop Saitama, nothing they had tried had stopped him, and there was no logical basis for expecting this to succeed where direct confrontation had failed. But because it forced a question about the nature of what Saitama was and what he cared about, and if the answer to that question was that he didn't care, that his indifference extended to outcomes rather than just to personal risk, Then the monarchs could conduct the destruction of the world around him without resistance. And if the answer was that he did care, that something in him responded to civilian harm in a way that his response to personal threat didn't capture, then the question became whether a single person could be everywhere simultaneously, and the mathematical answer to that question was clearly no. Jin-Woo went to Saitama at 6 in the morning. At the accommodation the association was still maintaining for him, despite the fact that several committee members had quietly proposed, in the aftermath of Gwangwon, that housing an entity who had punched a crater into the national square was a liability the association should consider addressing. Saitama was awake, doing his morning exercise routine in the small room with the focused, mechanical consistency of someone who had been doing the same thing for years and had long since stopped experiencing it as effort. Jin-Woo sat in the room's single chair and waited for him to finish and explain the situation without softening it, because Saitama had shown, consistently and across every type of information, that he processed things more usefully when they were stated directly. Saitama listened to the full explanation while cooling down. When Jin-Woo finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "So they're going to open a lot of gates at once?" Jin-Woo said yes, and the operative word was simultaneously, because the hunter system's response capacity was distributed. Teams, resources, S-rank hunters, all finite, all required to travel to their engagement points, and the Monarchs model depended on opening more simultaneous engagements than the system had capacity to address. Saitama said, "How many?" Jin-Woo said the ruler's estimate was between 40 and 60 high-rank gate emergencies in a compressed time window, globally distributed, targeting population centers. Saitama asked what Jin-Woo was planning to do about it. Jin-Woo said he was going to handle as many as the Shadow Monarch's abilities allowed him to reach in the time available, and that the Korean and Japanese hunter associations were being briefed on emergency deployment protocols, and that the international coordination network was being activated. He said all of this, and Saitama heard all of it and then said, with the flat practicality that Jin-Woo had come to recognize as his default mode for processing any category of information, "What happens to the ones nobody gets to?" Jin-Woo said, quietly, that was the part he didn't have an answer for. Saitama nodded once. He picked up his cape from the back of the chair Jin-Woo was sitting in, shook it out, and put it on over his jumpsuit. He said he could cover more ground than Jin-Woo if they divided the target list geographically, and he didn't worry about travel time. Jin-Woo looked at him and asked what he meant by not worrying about travel time, and Saitama said he could move pretty fast when he needed to, which was the same tone of voice he had used to describe the training regimen that had broken the laws of physical limitation, and Jin-Woo decided that this was not the moment to interrogate it. They spent 2 hours with the association's emergency coordination team, mapping the ruler's projected gate emergence sites against response capacity, and building a coverage plan that nobody in the room had a full emotional relationship with yet, because the full emotional relationship with simultaneously managing 50 catastrophic gate emergencies across 4 continents was something that required more processing time than 2 hours allowed. The association analysts worked with the focused intensity of people who had identified the concrete problem beneath the existential one, and were applying themselves to the concrete problem with everything they had. Jin-Woo and Saitama sat at the end of the table and divided the global map into sectors with the specific, quiet efficiency of 2 people who had already made their peace with what was coming, and were now just doing the logistics. It began on a Wednesday, at 9 in the morning Seoul time, which was simultaneously 3 in the morning in London, 10 at night in New York, and various inconvenient hours across the other targeted cities. 47 gates opened within a 14-minute window, globally distributed, all of them high rank, the smallest a confirmed B rank, and the largest registering at the outer edge of the measurement systems the hunter associations used for S rank categorization. Jin-Woo was already moving before the 14th gate opened. The Shadow Monarch's travel capacity deployed at maximum. Shadow soldiers seated ahead at target sites to slow emergence timelines while he closed the distance. The Hunter Association's emergency deployment activated simultaneously. Every available hunter in every affected country moving toward their nearest emergency site. Saitama was in Tokyo when the gate over London opened. Then he was in London. The interval between those two statements was not a meaningful duration of time. It was the kind of speed that the world's fastest hunters, Jin-Woo included, at full Shadow Monarch velocity, could not approach, a speed that wasn't running or flying in any mechanical sense but something more like the resolution of an intention into a location, the casual bypass of the concept of travel distance by something that had decided it was not relevant. He hit the London gate's emergence and kept moving. Mumbai, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Chicago. Each site, one punch. Gate destroyed at the point of emergence before the dungeon interior could fully establish. The monsters inside returned to wherever monsters went when the dungeon that contained them ceased to exist. The civilians who had been in the blast radius of each gate's opening looking up at the sky, where the rift had been and finding it already sealed, already gone. The whole event compressed into a duration too short to fully experience before it was over. The Monarchs watched their carefully constructed simultaneous cascade close, gate by gate, faster than the projected response timeline, by an order of magnitude that their models had not included, because their models had been built without a variable for Saitama's movement speed, which was the same fundamental problem every model built without a variable for Saitama produced, a gap between projection and outcome that widened the faster he moved. Of the 47 gates, 31 were cleared by Saitama. 14 were cleared by Jin-Woo and the Hunter Association response teams. 2 were cleared late, after civilian casualties had already occurred. A gate in northern Canada that opened in a low population area with no nearby hunter response, and a gate in a coastal city in Indonesia where the local hunter infrastructure had not received the emergency notification in time. Those two sites were the answer to Jin-Woo's earlier silence, the part that didn't have a solution, the cost of a system that was finite meeting a problem that was designed to exceed it. Saitama came back to Seoul in the early afternoon and sat on the steps outside the association's building for a while without going inside. Jin-Woo found him there an hour later. He was looking at his shoes. Jin-Woo sat next to him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that improved the situation, and Saitama had the specific quality of silence that didn't require management. After a while, Saitama said he'd been fast enough for 45 out of 47. Jin-Woo said yes. Saitama said he didn't know what to do with the two he hadn't made. Jin-Woo said he knew the feeling and he meant it, and Saitama looked at him briefly and appeared to believe him, which was something. The Monarchs' Cascade had failed to produce the strategic outcome they had designed it for. But the two sites where it had succeeded were not nothing, and the Monarchs knew it, and Saitama knew it, and the weight of that knowledge was a different kind of problem than anything the system or the Monarchs or the rulers had introduced yet, because it wasn't a tactical problem. It was a human one. The two sites where the Monarchs' Cascade had succeeded were not chosen randomly. Jin-Woo understood this 3 days after the event, reviewing the global gate emergence pattern with the association's analytical team and the tactical intelligence that the rulers had forwarded through the Busan Channel. The gate in northern Canada and the gate in coastal Indonesia had been placed with precise knowledge of the hunter response, network's geographic blind spots, not because they were the easiest targets, not because the Monarchs had been aiming for maximum civilian impact in those specific locations, but because they were the sites most likely to be uncovered in a scenario where Saitama was moving at maximum speed through the highest priority targets. The Monarchs had not expected the Cascade to succeed globally. They had designed it to fail in a specific way, to produce exactly 2 successful emergences in exactly the locations they chose, because what they needed was not mass destruction. What they needed was something more precise than that. They needed Saitama to feel the two he hadn't reached. Jin-Woo sat with this understanding for a full day before he told anyone, because the implication was something that required careful handling. The Monarchs had conducted an intelligence operation disguised as a military one, and the intelligence they were gathering was not tactical. They didn't need tactical information about Saitama. They'd already confirmed that direct engagement was closed as a viable option. What they were gathering was psychological. They were learning whether Saitama had a weight that could be placed on him, whether the being who felt nothing from a continental force strike could feel something from an outcome. They were learning whether boredom was truly his foundational state, or whether something lived underneath it that could be reached by a different kind of pressure. And Saitama sitting on the association steps looking at his shoes was information. The Monarchs had felt it the way they felt everything, not through observation, but through the world's metaphysical substrate, the deep medium that registered significant emotional states of powerful entities, the way a seismograph registered ground movement. Saitama's response to the two failed sites had been quiet and contained, and had lasted approximately 4 hours before he stood up and went inside and ate dinner and apparently slept normally. But those 4 hours had registered, and the Monarchs had recorded what they felt, and what they had felt was not the clean indifference they had encountered in every other category of contact, but something with texture to it, something that had a shape. Not grief in the conventional human sense, not guilt in the way that humans experienced guilt, but a specific discomfort with outcomes that fell below the standard he held himself to, a discomfort that connected to something deeper in him than tactics or power. The last gambit was built on this. Jin-Woo understood it when the ruler's communication arrived on the 4th day after the Cascade, urgent, and compressed in the way that the rulers communicated when the time available for measured language had run out. The Monarchs were not going to open more gates. They were not going to send another direct engagement. They were going to do something that the rulers had been afraid of since the beginning of this phase of the war, and had designed the entire system to prevent. They were going to attempt a direct corruption of the system's foundational architecture. Not an attack on individual hunters or hunter infrastructure, but a deep structural intervention in the code layer of reality that produced gates and dungeons and the cultivation of human power, an attempt to invert the system's purpose from preservation to acceleration, to take the mechanism designed to develop humanity toward the point where it could survive the Monarchs' war, and redirect it toward the mechanism that produced the war's intended outcome. The total consumption of accumulated soul energy. If it succeeded, every dungeon on Earth would become a death trap simultaneously. Every gate would open at maximum destructive capacity. Every hunter system in every country would fail or invert. The human casualties in the first 24 hours would be, by the ruler's estimate, in the hundreds of millions. Not because the Monarchs could field the forces to produce that outcome directly, but because the system, inverted, would do the work for them. The infrastructure of preservation turned into the infrastructure of destruction, using the very framework that had been built to save humanity as the engine of its ending. Jin-Woo could fight Monarchs. He could not fight the system's own architecture being used against itself, because the Shadow Monarch's power, as enormous as it was, operated within the system, was in a deep sense a product of it, the apex expression of what the system could cultivate, which meant that its limits were the system's limits, and its vulnerabilities were the system's vulnerabilities. If the Monarchs corrupted the foundation, Jin-Woo's power was built on the foundation they were corrupting. Saitama's was not. Jin-Woo went to Saitama that evening and explained everything. Not a summary, not a tactical briefing, everything from the beginning, the Monarchs and the rulers and the war and the system and what the system was and what its corruption would mean, and why Jin-Woo could not stop it alone. He talked for 40 minutes, and Saitama listened with the complete, patient attention he gave to things when he understood they mattered, which was a different quality of attention than the polite surface engagement he offered to guild recruitment pitches and association protocols. Something quieter and more directed, his eyes not moving from Jin-Woo's face for the entire duration. When Jin-Woo finished, Saitama said, "So the problem isn't the Monarchs. The problem is the thing they're going to do to the world while everyone is trying to stop them." Jin-Woo said yes, that was the problem. Saitama said, "And you need me to be at the point where they do it, not at whatever they put in front of me to draw me away from it." Jin-Woo said yes. Saitama thought for a moment and said that made sense, but he wanted to understand one thing clearly. When the corruption started, when the system's architecture began to invert, what did that actually look like in the physical world? What was the thing he needed to find and hit? Jin-Woo said it would be a convergence point, a location where the Monarchs concentrated their interference with the system's foundation, and it would be detectable not by any instrument or mana signature, but by its effect on the environment. A place where the normal laws of the physical world began to behave incorrectly, where the fabric of what made things real started showing its structure in ways it shouldn't. Saitama said okay. He said he understood. He said he had one more question. Jin-Woo said what? Saitama asked whether, if he hit the convergence point, it would actually fix the system or just interrupt the corruption temporarily. Jin-Woo said he didn't know, that the ruler's communication had not specified, that there was a real possibility that the answer was temporary interruption rather than permanent resolution. Saitama nodded at this and did not seem to find it a reason to revise his position, which was the response Jin-Woo had expected, and which confirmed something about Saitama that he had been fairly certain of since the Han River conversation. He was not calculating outcomes, not weighing personal benefit, not asking the question that every other powerful entity Jin-Woo had known would have asked first, which was what's in it for me. He was asking operational questions because he had already decided to help and needed the operational questions answered to help correctly. The Monarchs began the corruption attempt on a Thursday night, Seoul time, when the world's attention was distributed across the aftermath of the Cascade, hunter associations still processing casualties, governments still issuing statements, the global public still inside the particular kind of shock that came from a day in which 47 simultaneous dimensional emergences had been treated as a single coordinated news event. The convergence point manifested in the physical world as Jin-Woo had described, a location in the mountains northeast of Seoul where reality began to display its seams, where the sky had the wrong color for the hour, where the trees at the perimeter of the effect zone were growing in directions that didn't correspond to any available light source, where the ground hummed at a frequency that had no mechanical origin. Jin-Woo met the three monarchs who arrived as decoys at the mountain's base while Saitama went up. He did not ask Saitama if he was ready. The question would have been strange, and they both knew it, and there was a kind of respect in not asking it. Saitama walked up the mountain in the dark with his hands in his pockets, and the corruption of reality grew denser and more specific around him as he climbed, the world becoming increasingly wrong in every direction, gravity acquiring a slight personal quality, light behaving as though it had preferences, sound arriving at times that didn't correspond to their sources. None of it impeded him. The monarch's corruption of the system's architecture had no mechanism to impede something that didn't draw from the system's architecture, and Saitama moved through the distorting fabric of the physical world the way he moved through everything, without resistance, not because he was overcoming the resistance, but because the resistance, in the most fundamental sense, did not have the right category of existence to apply to him. He reached the convergence point at 2:17 in the morning and stood in front of it for a moment. It was not visually dramatic. It looked like a place where the air had decided it didn't want to be air anymore, a shimmer that wasn't light and a pressure that wasn't mana and a wrongness that was specific and structural rather than atmospheric. The monarch's collective intelligence was threaded through it, not physical, not present in any form he could punch as such, but concentrated there, conducting the corruption through a point of maximum system vulnerability. Saitama raised his fist. He thought about the two gates he hadn't reached. He thought about it not as motivation. He was not a person who needed motivation in the conventional sense, but as information, the specific operational information that told him what the right amount was. He hit the convergence point once, and the force was not directed outward into the environment but inward, into the foundational layer of reality that the corruption was operating in, into the metaphysical substrate beneath the system's architecture. And the effect propagated through that substrate in a wave that had no mana signature and no energy classification, but that the rulers felt simultaneously, all of them, in the deepest layer of their awareness, as a correction. Not a patch, not a temporary stabilization, something more thorough than that, something that reached the place the corruption had seated itself, and resolved it in the specific way that only a force outside the system's framework could resolve a problem inside the system's framework, by engaging it at a level prior to the level where the problem existed. The shimmer in the air above the mountain dissipated. The trees began growing correctly. The sky returned to the color appropriate for 2:17 in the morning in late autumn northeast of Seoul. The ground stopped humming. The Monarchs' collective awareness, engaged through the convergence point, received the full transmission of what Saitama had done and recoiled from it for the second time in this conflict, a recoil that was less a fear response than a computational one. A system encountering an input so far outside its parameters that the only available response was to stop processing and start over. Jin-Woo felt the three decoy monarchs disengage simultaneously, their physical projections collapsing as the intelligence directing them was pulled back into the collective for emergency consultation. He stood in the sudden silence at the mountain's base and looked up the slope, and after a moment Saitama appeared out of the dark at the tree line, hands back in his pockets, moving at a comfortable downhill pace. Jin-Woo asked if it was done. Saitama said he thought so. It was hard to tell exactly, but the weird air thing was gone. Jin-Woo said the Monarchs had just pulled back across every active engagement point simultaneously. Saitama said that was probably a good sign. They stood at the base of the mountain in the dark for a moment. Jin-Woo said, "The rulers are saying the corruption was reversed completely, not just interrupted." Saitama said that was good. Jin-Woo said he wasn't sure good was a large enough word for it. Saitama said fair enough. He said he was hungry, which was a reasonable thing to say at 2:30 in the morning after preventing the structural inversion of the world's reality framework. And Jin-Woo found, to his own mild surprise, that he was also hungry, and they went back down the mountain to find somewhere that was still serving food, and the world behind them was intact, and the Monarchs were in retreat for the first time in the history of their war. And none of that had happened through the system that the rulers had built, or the power that Jin-Woo had cultivated, but through something that had arrived from elsewhere and had no name that fit neatly into the architecture of what the world thought it understood about itself. The Monarchs did not return. This was not, initially, something the hunter associations or the international coordination networks were willing to state as a confirmed fact, because the history of the war between monarchs and rulers was long enough that any pause in monarch activity had always been a pause, and not an ending, and the institutions built to respond to monarch-level threats had a professional and arguably existential interest in not declaring victory prematurely. The monitoring infrastructure stayed active. The emergency deployment protocols remained in standing readiness. Jin-Woo continued his passive awareness of the metaphysical substrate with the same consistency he had maintained since becoming what he was, checking the deep register of the world's energy architecture the way a person checks a wound that has been treated, not expecting the worst, but not willing to stop checking until enough time has passed to call it healed. What he found, over the weeks following the mountain, was a consistent and deepening silence in the monarch register, not the silence of entities preparing something, not the compressed strategic quiet of the collective deliberation he had felt before the Gwangwamun emergence. A different silence, broader and flatter, the silence of a calculation being conducted at a timescale too long for any human framework to perceive its resolution. The monarchs had not been destroyed. The monarch of destruction had returned to the deeper metaphysical layer it had been ejected from and had not re-emerged. The others remained in that layer, present in the way that they had always been present, ancient and purposeful and immovable in their fundamental orientation. But inactive, their deployment apparatus withdrawn, their distributed gate probe network dormant, the long machinery of their war effort in a state that had no precedent in its history. The rulers communicated their assessment through the Busan Channel 7 weeks after the mountain. The old physicist called Jin-Woo in the early morning with his notebook open, and his voice carrying the particular quality it had when the rulers were communicating something they considered important, a steadiness that sat just above his natural register. The assessment was this: the corruption reversal had not merely interrupted the monarch's last gambit. It had reached the foundational level of the war's metaphysical infrastructure, and had corrected something there that predated the current engagement, a deep structural imbalance in the substrate that both monarchs and rulers operated within, something that had been driving the conflict's escalation for longer than any current entity involved had been aware of it as a driver rather than a condition. The rulers did not know if this meant the war was over. They knew it meant the war had changed, that the specific engine that had been running it had been disrupted at a level none of the parties involved had the access or the leverage to reach. They communicated this with the structural humility that had characterized all of their communications about Saitama. The awareness of an intelligence that had built the system, acknowledging that the system was not the whole of what existed, and that what existed beyond it had just demonstrated, one more time, that the boundary they had thought was the boundary was not. Jin-Woo sat with this for a long time. Then he set the phone down and went to the window and looked at Seoul in the morning, whole and continuing, the Han River visible in the middle distance carrying its ordinary traffic, the city doing what cities did when the worst had not happened, which was everything, unremarkably, in the way that ordinary life was its own form of extraordinary when measured against what it had almost not been. The Hunter Association held a series of meetings over the following month that attempted to formalize what had happened and what it meant for the Hunter system going forward. These meetings produced several hundred pages of documentation, a revised emergency response protocol, a new international coordination framework, and no consensus at all on the category that Saitama should be placed in, because the categories still did not exist, and the people responsible for creating new ones found, when they sat down to create them, that the conceptual vocabulary available was insufficient for the task. The system scanner team filed a final report on the measurement problem that concluded, after 40 pages of technical analysis, that the failure to classify Saitama's power level was not a failure of the equipment or the methodology, but a failure of the underlying theoretical framework that the equipment and methodology were designed to operate within, and that correcting for this would require the development of an entirely new theoretical framework, which was work that could potentially take decades and would require significant resources, and might ultimately be impossible if the thing being measured did not itself operate within the scope of what theory could reach. The report was classified and filed, and added to the growing archive of documentation about Saitama that collectively communicated, with varying degrees of technical sophistication, that the situation exceeded the tools available for understanding it. Sung Jin-Woo's personal assessment was simpler and did not require 40 pages. He had spent 3 months in close proximity to Saitama, had observed him in conditions ranging from guild recruitment meetings to direct monarch-level combat, had shared food with him on multiple occasions, had asked him questions, and received answers that were honest in the specific way that things said by someone who had no interest in strategic communication were honest, not because the truth was useful to him, But because the distinction between truth and something other than truth had not registered as operationally meaningful, and what Jin-Woo had concluded was that Saitama was exactly what he appeared to be, which was the most genuinely disorienting thing about him, because in the world Jin-Woo operated in, nothing was exactly what it appeared to be. Power was always connected to ambition. Strength was always connected to a story about where it came from and what it was for. The system had built that connection into the architecture of what hunters were, had made the narrative of power inseparable from its practice, had designed a world in which every strong thing was strong for reasons that could be followed back to a source and forward to an intention. Saitama had done push-ups. That was the source. The intention, as far as Jin-Woo could determine after 3 months of observation, was to find something that was hard enough to make being alive feel like something other than maintenance. He had not found it. The monarch of destruction at full engagement commitment had come closest, had moved him 3 meters, and in the silence after that encounter, the thing that Saitama had said, that it was a little better, at least, was a statement that Jin-Woo returned to regularly, because it was the truest thing he'd heard expressed about the specific loneliness of being at the top of any system, the way that height and isolation were not separable once you reached a certain altitude, the way that the thing you climbed toward turned out, on arrival, to be the thing you left behind. Saitama stayed in Seoul for 4 more months after the mountain. He ate at a rotating selection of restaurants that he evaluated seriously and remembered accurately. He attended 2 Hunter Association briefings when Jin-Chul specifically requested his presence, and sat through them with patient attention, and occasionally asked questions that cut to the actual center of whatever was being discussed, in a way that made the analysts presenting feel simultaneously seen and destabilized. He walked along the Han River most evenings at a pace that suggested contentment, or something adjacent to contentment, a relationship with the world around him that was not happy in any performed sense, but was present in a way that seemed, after everything, like its own form of adequacy. He and Jin-Woo had dinner together 12 times over those 4 months, by Jin-Woo's count, at the kind of places where the food was good and the prices were reasonable, and nobody looked at either of them with the specific intensity of people who understood what they were looking at. They talked sometimes and sometimes didn't, and what Jin-Woo found in those evenings was something he hadn't expected to find, which was the particular comfort of being with someone who did not need anything from you, who was not calculating the relationship's value or managing its dynamics or positioning for future benefit, who was simply there because the food was good and the company was tolerable and the evening was available to be spent on something. The gate that took Saitama home opened on a Tuesday morning above the Gangnam district, almost exactly 4 months after the first one. Same jagged violet shape, same absence of warning, same immediate failure of every scanner in a 4-kilometer radius. Saitama looked at it for a moment from the street below, assessed its position relative to the nearest building with the practical spatial awareness of someone who had fallen out of a gate before and had preferences about where he landed, and then looked at Jin-Woo, who had felt the gate open, and arrived at the street in time to find Saitama already standing beneath it, grocery bag in hand. Jin-Woo said, "That's yours." Saitama said it looked like it, yeah. Jin-Woo said it would close on its own if he didn't go through it, probably based on the previous one. Saitama said probably, though he wasn't entirely sure how these things worked. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Saitama said he was glad he'd been here, even if he still didn't fully understand what Hunter Associations were for. Jin-Woo said something had changed because Saitama had been here, and he said it plainly without the qualifications he might have applied in a different conversation, because plainness was the right register for this particular exchange. Saitama said he didn't know about that, but he was glad the weird air thing on the mountain had worked out, because he hadn't been completely sure it would. Jin-Woo said he hadn't been either. Saitama looked up at the gate one more time, and then at the street around him, at Seoul going about its morning in the ordinary and continuous way that cities went about their mornings when they were intact, and his expression had the specific quality that Jin-Woo had learned to read over months. Not happiness exactly, not satisfaction, but the provisional and honest acknowledgement that some things were better than nothing. That some places left a mark even on something that moved through the world without leaving one of its own. He went up through the gate, and it sealed behind him and the scanners in a 4-kilometer radius, rebooted, and returned to baseline readings, and Seoul continued in every direction in the ordinary way that it had learned, over months of extraordinary events, to maintain. The Hunter Association's file on Saitama was closed and archived in a restricted access tier, classification, unresolvable status, departed power level, unmeasurable threat assessment, not applicable notes. See attached documentation, 847 pages, conclusions, none that fit the available frameworks. The system continued. The gates continued, lower in frequency now, more stable, the deep structural correction on the mountain having introduced something into the world's metaphysical substrate that the analysts couldn't measure, but that registered in the data as a consistent reduction in high-rank emergence rates over the following year. Then the year after that, a slow, quiet settling of the machinery of a war that had been running for longer than the framework built to contain it. Jin-Woo continued. He was still what he was, still at the apex of what the system could produce, still the Shadow Monarch in the fullest sense of that designation. And the designation meant something different now than it had before, not smaller, not diminished, but differently bounded, understood against a context it hadn't previously included. On some evenings, he walked along the Han River at the pace that suggested something adjacent to contentment, and he thought about the question that Saitama had not asked, because it had not occurred to him to ask it. Not what are you? Not what do you want? But the simpler and stranger question of what it felt like to be the strongest thing in a system, and whether the system was the whole of what mattered, and whether the answer was yes, or the answer was something more complicated and more honest than yes. Jin-Woo did not arrive at a final answer. He continued asking the question. That felt in the end like the right relationship with it. The world did not return to normal. Normal had been a condition of before, and before was not available anymore. What the world returned to was itself, damaged in specific places, changed in its deep structure. In possession of documentation it couldn't fully interpret about something it had encountered and survived without understanding, continuing in the way that things continued when the worst had happened and not been the end, which was not triumphantly but honestly, one day at a time. In full awareness that the day was there to be spent, and that spending it was its own form of answer to all the questions that didn't have better ones. That was enough. It had to be, and on most days in the specific way that most days allowed if you were paying attention it was.